Malcolm, good to see you again. We learnt this morning that two key concessions probably would have to be Ukraine would have to be told it can't join NATO, and there could be some sort of change in the Ukraine border. Is Zelensky going to wear either of those?
Well, those are sort of concessions that they should not be asked to make. Essentially, the first one basically means that Ukraine has no security guarantees from the West in the face of future Russian aggression. And the second one basically means Russia is rewarded for its aggression since 2022. So what that will do is give Russia time to rearm and regroup its military capability so that in a year or two it can launch the war again, and without any sort of security assistance from NATO, with the Trump administration blocking the ability of European states to assist Ukraine. Ukraine is at the mercy of Russia. So this is a really bad deal, not just for Ukraine, but also for European security.
I saw Alexander Downer, our former foreign minister, on with Chris Kenny before us tonight, and he prosecuted the argument that perhaps the Americans could put up their own guarantees to Zelensky, that America would be their protector rather than wider NATO. Is that a possibility?
No. I mean, it's very clear coming out of the Trump administration that America is washing its hands of Ukraine, basically pulling the rug out from under them. And so the Ukrainians now face, as I said, the prospect that any deal that is made effectively delivering peace in our time will be a temporary measure at best, just like it was in Munich in 1938, and essentially give the Russians time to rearm and regroup. And the Russians can then launch the war again when it's a time of their choosing. But worse, what it does is it sends the signal to Moscow that the US no longer has a willingness to support NATO. And Hegseth basically made that clear in his statement at NATO today, where he said the US is no longer the primary security guarantor of NATO. And so that will only embolden Putin to be more aggressive and more provocative, potentially directly attack NATO itself. So as was the case in Munich in 1938, in 2025, another deal is being done that could sow the seeds of a wider war.
Malcolm, back in our area, we heard late this afternoon out of Canberra that there was a worrying incident with the Chinese military. Now, this is up in the Timor Strait. It had a Chinese fighter jet letting off flares right near one of our aircraft. The ADF is also monitoring 3 Chinese warships separately to that, which have been observed operating near our northeast coast. The jet incident near China first, that seemed very dangerous, and there was remarks from Richard Miles on Sky today that it went very close to that aircraft.
Exactly. That Chinese fighter, a J-16, was within 30 metres of our Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft. It released flares, and if those flares had gone into the intakes of the P-8's engines, it could have exploded the fuel in the aircraft, destroying the aircraft and killing all on board. And a P-8 usually has between 12 and 16 people on board. So that Chinese fighter aircraft put the lives of those Australian citizens, those Australian servicemen and women, at direct risk. And it did it deliberately, because there is no way that that Chinese pilot would have accidentally released those flares. That pilot knew exactly what they were doing, and it was an attempt to intimidate Australia through a direct action against our military.
What about these 3 naval vessels from China that have been sailing through the Timor Sea and are off the northeastern coast of Australia? That's not unusual, but obviously we need to keep an eye on them.
Absolutely. I mean, they're operating within our maritime approaches. And I think that it's only natural and sensible that we keep an eye on these ships. One of them is a Renhai class cruiser, a Type 55, which is the world's most powerful warship in the sense that it has the largest number of vertical launch system rocket cells, missile cells in its design. So it is very heavily armed. It's operating very close to Australia in terms of its ability to gather intelligence and support operations. And so I think it's quite sensible for the Australian Defence Force to deploy air and naval assets just to keep an eye on that flotilla of ships to make sure that they don't come any closer, particularly that they don't intrude into our territorial waters, which extend out to 12 nautical miles.
Malcolm, it was good to catch up with you. Thanks a lot. I'll talk to you again soon.